I am Allison, 34 years old, and until last Tuesday, I thought I knew exactly how low my sister could sink. I opened my front door at 6:30 in the morning to grab a package and froze in my tracks. My sister had abandoned her twin 6-year-old children on my freezing porch, with nothing but 2 trash bags of clothes and a handwritten note claiming she would pick them up when they turned 16. I refused to just accept this abuse. I pulled out my phone and made a call that set off a chain reaction of absolute destruction. When that call ended, the truth behind her disappearance was more horrifying than I ever imagined. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect the innocent from your own toxic family. Growing up in the Chicago suburbs, my family dynamics were always perfectly clear. My older sister Melanie was the golden child, a former pageant queen whose lavish lifestyle was funded entirely by our parents. I was the scapegoat, the quiet one they assumed was a struggling accountant who would always be there to clean up their messes. They had no idea I was actually a managing partner at a massive private equity firm. The freezing morning wind bit through my thin silk robe as I stared down at my nephew Leo and my niece Mia. They were huddled together on the welcome mat, their small bodies shivering violently in the early frost. Leo had his arms wrapped tightly around his sister. Next to them sat 2 black plastic garbage bags bulging with hastily stuffed clothing. A piece of lined notebook paper was taped to Leo's jacket. I snatched the paper. The handwriting belonged to my sister Melanie. The message was brief, callous, and devoid of any maternal affection. It read, "Terrence and I need a break to fix our marriage. You have no husband and no life, so you can watch them. We will be back for them when they are old enough to drive. Do not bother calling, our phones are off." I crumpled the paper in my fist, a familiar burning anger rising in my chest. My family had treated me like a dumping ground for my entire life, but this crossed a line from selfish to criminal. I knelt down on the icy concrete and reached out to the twins. Mia looked up at me with large, tear-filled eyes, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. "Aunt Allison," she whispered, rubbing her frozen nose with a bare hand. "Mommy said we are playing a special game of hide and seek. She said if we stay perfectly quiet on your porch, we will win a giant prize." Leo sniffled and pulled his thin windbreaker tighter around himself. "Are we winning yet? Mommy told us to wait." I forced my voice to remain perfectly calm and warm, masking the absolute rage boiling inside me. "You won the biggest prize, sweetie." I smiled, scooping them both into my arms. "You get to come inside and have pancakes with extra syrup. Come on, let us get you out of the cold." I carried them into my foyer, locking the heavy mahogany door behind me. I did not bother calling my parents to whine or complain. I knew exactly how that conversation would go. My mother, Patricia, would immediately make excuses for Melanie, just like she always did. She would tell me to stop being dramatic and just step up for the family. But I was done stepping up for abusers. I settled the twins at my kitchen island, wrapping them in thick fleece blankets. I quickly whisked together batter and started making chocolate chip pancakes. I needed to keep them distracted, to keep them feeling safe while their entire world was unraveling. Leo grabbed a crayon from a cup on the counter and started drawing on a napkin, while Mia watched the stove with wide, exhausted eyes. "Did Mommy and Daddy go on an airplane?" Leo asked suddenly, not looking up from his drawing. "Daddy was yelling on the phone last night about the federal guys and needing a flight right now." My blood ran cold at his words. Terrence, my brother-in-law, was an African-American venture capitalist who loved to flaunt his wealth. He drove luxury cars, wore bespoke suits, and treated everyone around him like peasants. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on, constantly comparing my quiet life to his flashy success. But hearing a 6-year-old mention federal agents and sudden flights painted a very different picture. I placed pancakes in front of them, pouring warm syrup over the top. "Eat up, I'm going to make a quick phone call right over here." I stepped into my home office, shut the glass door just enough to muffle my voice, and pulled out my phone. I dialed the local precinct and Child Protective Services simultaneously on a conference call. I did not use the panicked tone of a helpless sister. I used the sharp, authoritative voice that I utilized every day in my professional life. My name is Allison. I need to report a felony child abandonment at my residence. My sister and her husband left their 6-year-old twins on my front porch in freezing temperatures with 2 garbage bags and a note relinquishing care. I need officers dispatched immediately to document the scene and initiate an emergency placement order. The dispatcher asked a series of rapid-fire questions. I answered them with cold precision. Yes, I have the handwritten note. Yes, I have video evidence on my security cameras. No, the parents are not reachable. The boy mentioned they might be fleeing on an airplane due to federal trouble. The mention of federal trouble changed the tone completely. The phone buzzed against my kitchen counter. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. Patricia. I answered and put it on speaker, holding the phone so the police officer in my foyer could hear. Before I could say hello, my mother's voice shrieked through the speaker, dripping with absolute venom. What is wrong with you, Allison? Are you out of your mind calling the cops on your own sister? I stared at the officer, who raised an eyebrow and readied his notepad. Mom Melanie dumped her children on my porch at dawn with 2 trash bags, I replied, keeping my voice flat. I did not invite them. I was not asked. She abandoned them. Do not use that dramatic word with me, Patricia snapped back. You are exaggerating just to get attention. Melanie and Terrence just need a month in Bora Bora to fix their marriage. They are under a lot of stress. A month, I repeated, letting the sheer absurdity of it hang in the air. A month in Bora Bora, without telling me, without packing coats for her children, and without knocking on the door to see if I was home. Yes, a month, Patricia yelled. You are 34 years old, single, and sitting in your boring apartment doing absolutely nothing with your life. You have no husband and no kids tying you down. You just push papers at some mediocre accounting firm. Watch your niece and nephew for once in your selfish life. You should be grateful Melanie trusts you with them. Grateful I cut her off, refusing to let her steamroll me like she had done since I was a teenager. You think I should be grateful she treated my front porch like a donation bin? You think abandoning terrified 6-year-olds playing hide-and-seek is an act of trust? It is child endangerment, Mom. Patricia scoffed. Endangerment. Terrence is a successful venture capitalist. He provides an incredible life for that family. They needed a break from the pressure. But of course you would not understand pressure. You have never taken a risk in your life. You have always been jealous of Melanie, jealous of her looks, jealous of her husband, jealous of her money. I did not raise you to be this vindictive. I held up a finger to the police officer, signaling for patience, and leaned closer to the phone. I am not jealous of a woman running away from her own kids, I shot back. And if Terrence is so rich and successful, why did they pack Leo and Mia's clothes in black plastic garbage bags? Why didn't they hire a live-in nanny? Why dump them on the doorstep of the sister you all love to call a pathetic failure? There was a brief, tense silence on the line. My mother hated logic. She operated entirely on delusion and emotional manipulation. Well, they had to leave in a hurry, she stammered, recovering quickly. Terrence had a last-minute business meeting out there. You are ruining their lives right now. If you do not call the police back and cancel this report, I swear to you, Allison, I will make sure you are cut out of this family forever. You will not get a dime of our money. I almost laughed. They had been holding their non-existent financial support over my head for years, completely unaware I made more in a single quarter than my father made in a decade. Keep your money, Mom, I said smoothly, because Melanie and Terrence are not going to Bora Bora. That is a lie. How dare you call your sister a liar? Patricia screamed, her voice reaching a fever pitch. You ungrateful little brat. I am calling the precinct right now to tell them you are having a mental breakdown. While she continued her tirade, I picked up my tablet from the kitchen island. I opened the security app linked to my front porch camera and beckoned the police officer over. I ignored my mother's screaming and tapped the screen, pulling up the footage from an hour ago. Officer, I said, clearly making sure Patricia could hear me. I have the high-definition video right here. It shows a black SUV pulling into my driveway at 6:15 this morning. Patricia stopped yelling abruptly. The sudden silence on the phone was deafening. You do not need to show them anything, she demanded, panic suddenly lacing her words. Allison, put the tablet down right now. Turn the phone off. I ignored her entirely and pressed play. The video showed Melanie dragging the twins up the walkway by their wrists. She shoved them toward the door, dropped the trash bags on the frozen concrete, and turned her back without a second glance. The officer leaned in, his expression hardening as he watched a mother abandon her children in real time. But there is something else, I told the officer, turning the volume up. The microphone on my porch camera is incredibly sensitive. Melanie did not just drive away. The driver's side window was rolled down. Watch this. I dragged the progress bar back to the moment Melanie sprinted away. On the phone, I could hear my mother taking quick, shallow breaths. Allison, I am warning you, do not do this, Patricia hissed. I tapped the audio enhancement feature. The sound of the idling engine filled the room, followed by a man's voice shouting from the driver's seat of the SUV. It was Terrence. His voice was frantic, laced with terror. "Leave the bags, Mel," he screamed from the vehicle. "If we miss this flight to Geneva, the feds are going to seize my passport. Get in the car right now." I paused the video recording and looked directly at the police officer. "Geneva, Switzerland," I said coldly. "Not Bora Bora. And you absolutely do not flee to Switzerland to fix your marriage. You flee there because they do not extradite for financial crimes at all." I ended the call before my mother could utter another hysterical defense. The click of the phone disconnecting echoed in the suddenly quiet kitchen. The police officer stared at me for a split second before the gravity of the word Geneva registered on his face. He did not hesitate. He immediately unclipped the radio from his shoulder and stepped toward the hallway, his voice dropping into a rapid, urgent cadence as he contacted his precinct. He relayed the flight destination, the names of my sister and brother-in-law, and the suspicion of flight from federal jurisdiction. While he coordinated with his dispatch, I turned my attention back to the kitchen island. Leo and Mia were finishing their pancakes, oblivious to the fact that their parents were currently attempting to become international fugitives. Mia kicked her legs against the stool, her face smeared with chocolate, while Leo proudly held up his napkin drawing of a very lopsided dog. I offered them both a warm, reassuring smile, wiping Mia cheek with a damp cloth. I praised Leo for his artwork and asked them to go pick out a movie to watch on the living room television. I needed them out of earshot for whatever was about to happen next. They scampered off, thrilled by the prospect of morning cartoons, completely unaware that their entire lives had just fractured beyond repair. The officer stepped back into the kitchen, his expression completely transformed. The polite procedural demeanor of a local cop responding to a domestic dispute had vanished. He looked at me with a mixture of grim realization and professional urgency. He explained that he had just spoken with a federal liaison. The FBI had been quietly investigating Terrence for the past 8 months. He was not a high-flying venture capitalist making brilliant trades to build his massive fortune. He was running a massive Ponzi scheme, defrauding investors out of tens of millions of dollars. The net had been closing in, and Terrence must have been tipped off. Melanie knew everything. They had liquidated whatever remaining clean assets they could find, packed their bags, and dumped their own children on my freezing porch, because traveling with minors would only slow down a frantic international escape. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal settled over the room. Melanie had not just abandoned her children to save her own skin. She had left them with me, assuming my seemingly quiet, unassuming life made me the perfect compliant babysitter who would just absorb the collateral damage of their financial crimes. She thought I would just sit in my apartment, overwhelmed and confused, while she sipped expensive champagne on a flight to the Swiss Alps. She was entirely wrong. The officer handed me his phone. A federal agent from the Chicago field office was on the line and needed to verify the custody situation. I took the phone, shifting instantly into the ruthless crisis management mode I utilize daily in corporate acquisitions. The agent began to explain the complex legalities of emergency guardianship in federal flight cases, using slow, patronizing language, as if he expected me to be a weeping, overwhelmed bystander. I cut him off immediately. I bypassed his gentle explanations and directly cited the specific statutes regarding emergency temporary placement. I provided my full legal name, my social security number, and confirmed that my residence was secure. I demanded the agent immediately fax the temporary guardianship authorization to my home office printer so I could have physical documentation before the local police departed the premises. The agent paused, clearly caught off guard by my sharp clinical efficiency. He asked if I needed victim support services dispatched to my address. I told him I did not need a counselor. I needed the legal paperwork establishing me as the sole guardian of Leo and Mia, and I needed it filed before my sister could land in any non-extradition country and attempt to claim international parental rights. I spoke with the precise commanding authority of a managing partner negotiating a hostile takeover. Within 10 minutes, the machine in my office whirred to life, printing the emergency placement order. I signed it on the kitchen counter, handing the carbon copy back to the local officer. The officer looked at me with a newfound respect. He promised that patrol cars would increase their routes past my address for the next 48 hours. He advised me to keep the doors locked and to call him directly if Terrence or Melanie somehow managed to contact me from whatever location they currently hid inside. I thanked him for his swift action, shook his hand, and walked him out to his cruiser. When I closed the front door, the silence of the house pressed in around me. The television chattered happily from the living room, a stark contrast to the federal criminal investigation that had just enveloped my family. I walked into the living room and watched the twins for a moment. They were curled up together on my sofa, completely engrossed in an animated movie, safe and warm. They were innocent collateral in a game of greed played by a mother who viewed them as luggage and a father who viewed everyone as a mark. I silently vowed right then and there that I would deploy every single resource at my disposal to protect them from any further trauma. I walked back into the kitchen to clean up the breakfast plates. I had barely turned on the faucet when the fragile peace of the morning violently shattered. The aggressive, unmistakable screech of tires tearing into my driveway echoed through the front windows. A powerful engine revved aggressively before being violently thrown into park. Heavy, furious footsteps immediately pounded up my concrete walkway, marching directly toward the entrance. Before I could even reach the foyer to check the security camera, violent, open-handed pounding rattled my front door fiercely inside its wooden frame. My parents, Richard and Patricia, had arrived for war. I had barely taken a step toward the foyer when the heavy door flew open, hitting the wall with a deafening crack. Richard and Patricia marched inside, bringing a gust of freezing wind with them. Their faces were flushed red eyes darting around with frantic energy. They completely ignored the living room where their 6-year-old grandchildren huddled under a fleece blanket. Leo and Mia shrank back against the sofa cushions, their eyes wide with fresh terror at the sudden explosion of noise. My mother marched directly up to me, her designer handbag swinging dangerously close to my face. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest, her voice shrill. "You are going to pick up that phone right this second and cancel whatever ridiculous police report you just filed," Patricia ordered, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "You will tell them you made a mistake. You will tell them the children were dropped off exactly as planned. Do you understand me? Fix this before Melanie gets flagged at the airport." I stood my ground. There is no mistake to fix, Mom. They dumped their children like garbage because Terrence is running from a federal indictment. I am not lying to the police to buy them time to flee the country and escape. My father lunged forward. Richard was a large, imposing man who had spent his entire life using his physical presence to bully people into submission. He stepped close deliberately, using his height to tower over me. He jabbed his finger toward my face, contorted with rage. "You listen to your mother, Allison. Terrence is a brilliant black entrepreneur. He is a visionary navigating a corporate world full of systemic bias, and he is finally breaking through the glass ceiling. The federal government is targeting him because they cannot stand to see a minority businessman succeeding at that elite level. It is a witch hunt, and you are playing right into their hands." I stared up into his angry eyes, completely unfazed. "A visionary?" I asked, my voice dripping with cold disbelief. "A visionary does not steal millions of dollars in a Ponzi scheme and run to Switzerland. A visionary does not leave his kids freezing on a concrete porch to avoid federal prison." Richard slammed his fist down on my kitchen island. "Do not you dare speak about him that way," he yelled, his face turning purple. "If they get detained at the airport, you will march down to the courthouse and use your meager accountant savings to post their bail. We spent hundreds of thousands sending Melanie to elite academies so she could secure a good future. We funded her entire lifestyle while you settled for community college and a boring desk job. It is time you finally paid us back for everything we sacrificed. You owe this family your loyalty, and you will drain your pathetic savings account to keep your sister out of a jail cell." The sheer audacity of his demand hung in the cold air. They genuinely believed my entire existence was meant to serve as a financial and emotional safety net for Melanie. Before I could respond, Mia let out a small, terrified whimper from the living room. The shouting was traumatizing the twins. I immediately stepped around my father, positioning my body squarely between my raging parents and the children on the sofa. I widened my stance, crossing my arms over my chest to form a physical barrier. "You are not going to scream in my home and traumatize these children any further," I stated, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "Let us get one thing perfectly straight right now. I do not owe you a single dime. You chose to blow your retirement funding Melanie and her vanity projects. You worshipped a con artist because he drove a sports car and stroked your fragile ego. I went to community college because you refused to co-sign a loan, and I built my life on my own. I am not withdrawing the police report. I am not paying bail. And you are not taking these children anywhere today." Patricia scoffed. "You think you have a choice?" she sneered, stepping up beside my father. "You are a single woman living alone. You have no authority here. Melanie and Terrence are their parents. The moment they are settled, they will demand these kids back, and the courts will laugh at you. You are nothing but a temporary babysitter, Allison. You have no power in this family, and you never will. You will do exactly as we say." I held her gaze, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they could not see the trap closing around them. They thought they were bullying a helpless, low-level clerk. They had absolutely no idea they were standing in the home of a private equity managing partner who could buy and sell their entire lives before lunch. My father raised his hand again, preparing to deliver another booming threat, but the shrill, vibrating alarm of my cell phone cut him off. The phone sat on the counter behind me, vibrating aggressively. I did not break eye contact with my mother as I reached backward and picked up the device. A news alert flashed across the screen, pushed directly from a local Chicago news affiliate. I glanced down, reading the breaking headline. My smile widened. "You should check your phones," I suggested softly. Richard frowned aggressively, pulling his phone from his coat pocket. Patricia mirrored his movement, her hands shaking slightly. I looked back at the twins who were watching me with quiet, hopeful eyes before I delivered the final crushing blow to my parents and their delusional escape plan. "Your brilliant son-in-law is not flying to Switzerland today, Mom. The federal agents just detained Terrence and Melanie right at the international departure gate. They are not going anywhere now." Richard stared at this glowing screen of his smartphone. The arrogant flush of anger vanished from his cheeks, replaced by a sickening, chalky pallor. He read the breaking news alert twice, his mouth opening and closing, without producing a single sound. Patricia snatched the device from his hands. Her eyes darted wildly across the text, scanning the horrific reality that her golden child was currently sitting in a federal holding room at the international departure gate. The silence in my kitchen was absolute. The only sound was the distant, muffled dialogue of the cartoon playing in the living room, a stark contrast to the absolute devastation settling over my parents. I stood my ground, my arms still crossed, watching the illusion of their perfect family shatter into pieces on my hardwood floor. "You did this," Patricia whispered. Her voice shook, trembling with a fragile, chaotic energy. "You tipped them off. You ruined your sister." "I did not tip anyone off, Mom. The federal agents do not need my help to track down a fugitive. I simply stopped you from sweeping this under the rug. Now I suggest you leave my house and call a defense attorney. You are going to need a very good one." Richard suddenly snapped back to life. The shock melted away, immediately replaced by a frantic, calculating desperation. He pocketed his phone and stepped toward the living room hallway. "We are taking the children," he declared, his voice tight and authoritative. "Get their coats, Patricia. We are leaving right now." I stepped directly into his path, blocking the hallway entrance. "You are not taking them anywhere." "Move out of my way, Allison," Richard barked, towering over me. "They are my grandchildren. Melanie will need us to have them when she gets out on bail. We are their family." "You are their grandparents," I corrected coldly. "But as of 20 minutes ago, I am their sole legal guardian. I have a federal emergency placement order signed and filed. You take one more step toward that living room, and I will have the patrol officer sitting at the end of my street arrest you for kidnapping." Patricia let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "A placement order? You have absolutely no idea what you are dealing with. This is not about babysitting. This is about survival. Hand them over right now." "Why?" I demanded, searching their panicked faces. "Why do you suddenly care so desperately about Leo and Mia? 10 minutes ago, you were furious that I called the police about them freezing on my porch. You were ready to let Melanie run off to Geneva and leave them here forever. Why the sudden desperation to play the loving grandparents?" Richard glared at me. His jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle twitched in his cheek. He looked at Patricia, sharing a silent, desperate conversation. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his thinning gray hair. "Because of the trust fund, you idiot," he spat. I frowned, completely caught off guard. "What trust fund?" "Your grandfather's trust," Richard growled, pacing the length of my kitchen. "Theodore was a paranoid old fool, but he had money. When he died, he bypassed your mother completely. He set up a $10 million trust fund exclusively for Leo and Mia." My breath caught in my throat. $10 million? My grandfather had always been a shrewd, pragmatic man who saw right through people. He had openly despised Terrence from the moment Melanie brought him home. He called Terrence a flashy con artist looking for a shortcut. I never knew he had actually put his money where his mouth was to protect the twins. He left it for their education and future. Patricia chimed in, her voice shrill and frantic. "But he put a poison pill in the contract because he hated Terrence. The clause is ironclad. If Terrence and Melanie ever abandon those children, or if they lose legal custody for any reason, they lose all access to the money. Complete control of the $10 million transfers immediately to whoever holds legal guardianship." The sickening truth crashed down on me like a physical weight. I stared at the two people who raised me, utterly repulsed by the sheer magnitude of their greed. They did not want to comfort their traumatized grandchildren. They did not care that Leo and Mia were terrified and confused. They just wanted the key to the vault. "You want the money?" I said, my voice dropping to a disgusted whisper. "Terrence owes millions in restitution for his Ponzi scheme. Melanie is facing federal prison time. You want guardianship so you can drain Leo and Mia's trust fund to pay Terrence's bail and hire high-priced defense lawyers. You want to bankrupt your own grandchildren to save a criminal. He is family," Patricia screamed, stepping toward me with clenched fists. "That money is just sitting there doing nothing. We need it now to save this family from absolute ruin. Terrence can make the money back once he beats these charges. He just needs capital to fight the indictment. You cannot keep that money from us, Allison. You do not deserve it." "I am not keeping it for myself, Mom," I shot back, my voice echoing loudly against the tile walls. "I am keeping it for them. For the children whose parents just tried to abandon them like unwanted luggage. Theodore knew exactly what Terrence was, and he knew exactly what you would do if things went south. He built a fortress around those kids, and I am standing at the gate." I shoved his heavy hand away. "You are absolutely pathetic. Leo and Mia are nothing but a blank check to you. They are innocent children, and they are staying right here with me. Get out of my house immediately. If you ever show up uninvited again, I will have you arrested for criminal trespassing. I will call the local police right this exact second. Leave my property." 2 days passed in hyper-vigilant exhaustion. I established a strict routine for Leo and Mia, keeping them distracted with board games and heavily monitored television. I had the windows locked, the security system armed, and my work laptop open. I thought I had secured the perimeter. I had severely underestimated the reach of a desperate, cornered narcissist with a smartphone. The federal agent called me on Thursday morning. Terrence had posted bail. My father, true to his threat, had liquidated a massive portion of his stock portfolio to secure a high-risk bond. Terrence and Melanie were out and they went on the immediate offensive. They did not hire a standard crisis public relations firm. They weaponized the internet. The first strike hit my phone at noon. My colleague Sarah forwarded me a link from a major social media platform asking if I was safe. I clicked the link and watched my sister deliver an Academy Award-winning performance. Melanie sat on a plush sofa wearing a muted gray sweater, her usually perfect hair deliberately mussed to convey maternal distress. The lighting was soft, casting sympathetic shadows across her face. She stared directly into the camera and wept without producing a single actual tear. "My sister Allison has kidnapped my babies," Melanie choked out, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. Terrence and I had to take a 48-hour emergency business trip to Europe to secure funding for his company. We left Leo and Mia with Allison, trusting her to keep them safe. Instead, she locked the doors, filed false police reports claiming we abandoned them, and manipulated a judge into granting a temporary hold. She has always been jealous of my marriage and my family. Now she is trying to steal my children. Please help us bring them home. By the time I finished watching the 2-minute clip, it already had 3 million views. The algorithm caught it, fed on the outrage, and pushed it to the top of every feed in the country. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of her lies, a second alert popped up on my screen. This one was a local news broadcast. Terrence had taken his campaign straight to traditional media. He sat across from a sympathetic local anchor wearing a sharp but slightly rumpled suit, playing the victim card with terrifying precision. He looked directly into the camera, utilizing the same charismatic charm he used to defraud his investors. "I am a Black entrepreneur, operating in a financial sector that actively roots against my success," Terrence declared, leaning forward to project earnest vulnerability. The federal probe is a complete misunderstanding, a targeted audit blown entirely out of proportion by a system that assumes successful minority businessmen are automatically guilty. But the real tragedy is my sister-in-law. Allison is a deeply unstable, unhappy woman. She is a spinster who has coveted my wife's life for a decade. The moment we stepped away to handle a corporate emergency, she weaponized this biased federal probe to enact a sick, jealous fantasy. She legally abducted my children using fraudulent claims. We are begging the public to demand justice. The coordinated attack was a masterclass in modern digital assassination. They blended the buzzwords of systemic injustice, maternal grief, and mental instability into a perfect viral cocktail. The court of public opinion convened immediately, and the verdict was unanimous. I was officially a monster. The fallout was instantaneous and toxic. The anatomy of a viral cancellation is terrifying in its speed and efficiency. Within an hour, I was completely doxxed. My personal cell phone number, my work email, and my home address were plastered across dozens of outrage forums. My phone began to vibrate continuously, a relentless stream of hatred pouring through the screen. The text messages rolled in by the hundreds. "You sick kidnapper. Give those babies back, you jealous psycho. We are coming for you." Some messages contained graphic, highly specific death threats. Strangers promised to burn my house down. They threatened to drag me into the street and handle the situation themselves if the police refused to act. My firm's server flagged over 5,000 hostile emails sent directly to my professional inbox demanding my immediate termination. The digital mob quickly spilled over into the physical world. When I stepped out onto my front porch to quickly retrieve a package, a car drove slowly past my driveway. The driver rolled down the window and screamed a stream of profanities at me, hurling a half-full cup of coffee that splattered against my mailbox. My neighbors, people I had exchanged friendly waves with for years, now stood in their yards glaring at me. The woman next door literally pulled her golden retriever inside and slammed her front door the moment we made eye contact. I was totally isolated, branded a criminal in my own community, my own. I shifted entirely into crisis management mode, the same cold efficiency I used to dismantle failing corporations. I immediately severed the wireless connection to the children's tablets, ensuring they could not accidentally stumble across their parents' vicious campaign. I locked down all my social media profiles, engaged a privacy scrubbing service to wipe my data from public directories, and contacted my firm's head of corporate security to alert them of the targeted harassment. I kept my voice light and cheerful whenever I entered the living room to check on Leo and Mia, masking the absolute terror bubbling in my chest. I was standing in the kitchen watching a dark sedan idle at the end of my street when the doorbell suddenly rang. It was a rapid, aggressive hammering. I checked the security feed. A sleazy-looking man in a cheap, poorly tailored suit stood on my front porch, clutching a thick manila folder. I cracked the door open. "You are officially served," he said, shoving the folder inside. "A summons for a custody hearing tomorrow and a $5 million defamation lawsuit funded by Richard." I looked down at the thick manila folder. The sleazy lawyer standing on my porch sneered, expecting me to crumble into a hysterical mess. My parents had sent him to deliver a custody summons and a frivolous $5 million defamation lawsuit, assuming the legal threats would break my spirit. They thought I was just a low-level accountant who would cave under the pressure. Instead of crying, I looked at the lawyer, looked back down at the documents, and let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I calmly closed the heavy door in his face. I walked back into the living room, letting the coldness melt from my features. Leo and Mia were building a fort out of sofa cushions, completely insulated from the toxicity outside. My housekeeper Maria, a retired pediatric nurse, sat on the floor helping Leo balance a pillow on the roof. I knelt down, pressing a warm kiss to Mia's forehead. I praised their architectural genius, my voice full of bright encouragement. I told them I had an important errand to run for a few hours, promising to bring back pizza for dinner. They cheered. I gave Maria a meaningful nod. She knew the perimeter was secure and the alarm was armed. The moment I slid into the driver's seat of my customized Porsche Panamera, the warm, gentle aunt vanished. I gripped the leather steering wheel, my mind shifting gears with lethal precision. I was no longer the quiet, unassuming sister my family loved to mock. I merged onto the expressway, driving straight into the heart of downtown Chicago. I pulled into the private VIP garage beneath the towering glass and steel structure of Vanguard Capital. The elevator shot up to the 54th floor, sliding open to reveal an ultra-modern reception area. The receptionist immediately stood up. "Good morning, Ms. Wilson. Your team is assembled in the main boardroom." I nodded briefly. Employees stepped out of my way, offering respectful greetings. My family genuinely believed I spent my days pushing paper at a mediocre suburban tax firm. They had absolutely no idea that I was a managing partner at Vanguard Capital, overseeing a portfolio worth over $4 billion. I specialized in dismantling corrupt corporate structures, liquidating toxic assets, and destroying hostile takeover attempts. My parents had picked a fight with a financial apex predator. I pushed open the double glass doors. My elite crisis management team sat around the long mahogany table. Marcus, my brilliant lead litigator, sat to my right. David, a former forensic accountant for the FBI, had his multi-monitor setup glowing at the head of the table. I tossed the custody summons and the defamation lawsuit onto the polished wood. "My family has officially declared war," I announced, taking my seat. The room went dead silent. "I want a complete microscopic forensic audit on every single person bearing my last name, and especially my brother-in-law, Terrence. I want every bank account, offshore shell company, hidden LLC credit card statement, and outstanding debt pulled and analyzed within the next hour." Marcus adjusted his glasses, pulling the lawsuit toward him. "A $5 million defamation suit from Richard and Patricia. It is completely baseless, designed purely for intimidation. We can have this thrown out by a judge before lunch tomorrow." "Do not just throw it out," I commanded, my voice dropping to an icy register. "I want you to countersue for malicious prosecution. I want them buried under so much legal paperwork they cannot breathe. Now talk to me about Terrence. What are we looking at?" David typed furiously, bringing up a complex web of financial data on the massive screen. Terrence is in catastrophic trouble. The federal probe is just the tip of the iceberg. He owes approximately $12 million in immediate restitution for the Ponzi scheme. But that is not the worst part. His legitimate venture capital firm has been insolvent for 3 years. He has been moving money between fake shell companies to create the illusion of liquidity. Melanie's lavish lifestyle, the designer clothes, the luxury cars, it was all funded by stolen investor capital. I stared at the screen, analyzing the crumbling architecture of my sister's perfect life. "What about Richard and Patricia?" I asked. "They just posted his bail." "How exposed are they?" David clicked another file, his eyes scanning the newly decrypted data. His hands suddenly stopped moving. He leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Wait a minute. This cannot be right." "What is it?" I demanded, standing up and walking toward the screen. David pulled up a property deed highlighting a string of recent transactions. "Your father liquidated a significant portion of his stock portfolio to cover the bail bond, but it was not enough. He was still short by over $2 million. Terrence told them he had a private lender who could cover the rest." "Let me guess," I said, crossing my arms. "The private lender does not exist." "It is worse than that," David said, looking up at me with an expression of absolute shock. "Terrence did not use a private lender. He used Richard and Patricia's primary residence. 2 weeks ago, Terrence somehow acquired power of attorney over your parents' estate. He secretly took out a massive fraudulent second mortgage on their mansion to cover his mounting legal debts and secure his own bail money. He leveraged their entire home without their knowledge." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. My parents had spent the morning screaming at me, demanding I hand over my nephew and niece so they could drain a $10 million trust fund to save Terrence. They were violently defending a man who had already stolen their home from under them. Richard and Patricia were actively fighting for a son-in-law who had just rendered them completely homeless. I stood perfectly still in the boardroom, letting the horrific realization fully wash over my mind. The revelation of the fraudulent second mortgage hung in the air of the Vanguard Capital boardroom like a guillotine. My parents were completely bankrupt, their mansion leveraged by the man they were fighting to protect. David forwarded the financial dossier to my secured tablet. I instructed my team to prepare the next phase. The digital mob outside was screaming for my head, but inside that boardroom, I held the power to dismantle my family's existence. Less than an hour later, my cell phone buzzed with a message from Richard. The tone was completely devoid of panic. It was arrogant, commanding, and dripping with unearned authority. He demanded a formal mediation meeting at 3 o'clock that afternoon. He named a luxurious, high-end corporate mediation center in Chicago, an obvious intimidation tactic designed to make me feel small. He explicitly stated this was my final opportunity to settle the matter out of court. They genuinely believed their coordinated viral smear campaign had terrified me into submission. They thought I was a weak, frightened accountant ready to beg for mercy. I calmly replied with a single word confirming my prompt attendance. When I walked into the glass-walled conference room at 3 o'clock, the atmosphere was suffocatingly smug. Melanie sat at the center of the polished oak table wearing a white designer blazer. Her hair was perfectly styled, erasing any trace of the tearful mother she had played on social media hours earlier. Terrence sat beside her, exuding the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Richard and Patricia flanked them like loyal foot soldiers, their chins raised in triumphant defiance. Their sleazy defense attorney sat at the end of the table, tapping a gold pen against a stack of documents. I took my seat opposite them, placing my leather portfolio on the table. I did not speak a word. I simply folded my hands and waited. Terrence smiled, a predatory, sickening expression. "Look at you, Allison. You really thought you could play in the big leagues. You thought you could use a temporary placement order to extort us. But you forgot who you are dealing with. I am a visionary. I build companies. I create wealth. You push paper in a cubicle. Did you honestly believe your pathetic little life could withstand the pressure I can bring down on you?" Melanie leaned forward, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "You have always been desperate to be me, Allison. You resented my marriage, my success, my beautiful home. You thought stealing my babies would finally make you feel important. But look at what happened. The entire country knows exactly what you are, a jealous, unstable spinster. You cannot walk out of your front door without your neighbors spitting on you. We control the narrative. We control the public. You have absolutely nothing. Patricia nodded vigorously, crossing her arms over her chest. We warned you, Allison. We told you to drop this nonsense and support your family. Now your reputation is completely ruined. You will be lucky if you do not lose your miserable little job over this scandal. You brought this entirely on yourself by being so bitter and ungrateful. I maintained my silence, letting their voices fill the room. They were so intoxicated by their own perceived superiority that they failed to notice the absolute calm radiating from my side of the table. I was not trembling. I was not crying. I was watching them dig their own graves with every arrogant syllable they uttered. Terrence confidently gestured to his lawyer, who slid a thick stapled document across the table toward me. It stopped inches from my hands. That is our settlement offer. Terrence dictated, his voice dripping with condescension. It is very simple. You are going to sign over guardianship of Leo and Mia immediately. You are going to surrender all administrative control of Theodore's trust fund to me as their rightful father. Furthermore, you are going to record a public video apology reading a script my public relations team has prepared. You will confess to fabricating the abandonment claims out of jealousy. You will state that we are loving, devoted parents. If you sign this right now, we will drop the $5 million defamation lawsuit and let you crawl back to your miserable, invisible life. If you refuse, we will bankrupt you, ruin you, and ensure you never see our children again. Richard slammed his heavy fist on the table for extra emphasis. Sign the damn paper, Allison. Stop embarrassing yourself and fix the mess you made. I looked down at the settlement document. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, full of aggressive clauses and absolute surrenders. I looked up at Melanie, whose face was twisted into a triumphant sneer. I looked at Terrence, who was already mentally spending the $10 million he thought he had secured. I looked at my parents, who were perfectly willing to throw me to the wolves to protect a criminal. Slowly, deliberately, I unclasped my leather portfolio. I bypassed their settlement entirely and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper bearing the official seal of a federal judge. I retrieved a sleek fountain pen from my pocket. You are right about one thing, Terrence, I said, my voice cutting through the room with the lethal precision of a scalpel. You do build things. You built a house of cards, and it is currently collapsing on top of you. I placed my pen on the signature line of the document I had brought. I pressed down, signing my name with bold, sweeping strokes. I capped the pen, picked up the paper, and slid it directly across the table. It came to rest right on top of their worthless settlement offer. I leaned forward, locking eyes with Terrence, as his arrogant smile finally began to falter. I did not sign your settlement, I whispered. I just signed the federal injunction freezing the $10 million trust. The glass doors of the downtown Chase elite branch parted, and Melanie marched through them like a conquering general. It was 9 o'clock the following morning. She wore a pristine white Chanel suit carrying a Birkin bag. Her posture screamed absolute entitlement. She bypassed the velvet rope indicating the teller line. She marched directly toward the frosted glass office of the branch manager, David Sterling. Melanie did not knock. She simply shoved the door open, dropping her Birkin onto his desk with a heavy, arrogant thud. David, I need a priority wire transfer executed immediately, she demanded. $500,000 sent directly to the trust account of Sterling and Vance Legal Defense. The routing numbers are in my file. Good morning, Mrs. Vance. David offered a polite smile. I will need to verify the account details before we can initiate a transfer of that magnitude. I am not sitting down. Terrence needs that retainer posted by noon, or the legal team will not file his motions. You know exactly who I am. Do your job right now. David turned to his dual monitors. His fingers danced across the keyboard. The polite smile vanished from his face, replaced by a rigid mask of corporate protocol. Mrs. Vance, I am afraid I cannot execute this transfer. I cannot authorize any transactions on this account. Melanie scoffed, rolling her eyes. What are you talking about? It is the primary trust. There is $10 million sitting in cash. Refresh your screen immediately. I have refreshed it, Mrs. Vance. The system is showing a hard lock. The account has been completely frozen by a federal injunction. We received the official court order late yesterday afternoon. I am sorry, but your access is strictly denied. Access denied. The words echoed in the small office. Melanie stared at him. That is impossible, she snapped, her voice rising an octave. That is my children's money. My sister is a jealous liar who fabricated a piece of paper to scare you. You are going to lift that freeze right now or I will have your job. I assure you the federal court order is perfectly legitimate, David replied, his tone turning cold. Vanguard Capital's legal division served us directly. We are legally bound to comply. You cannot withdraw a single dollar. Melanie lost her mind. The pristine, wealthy socialite facade cracked and shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered animal underneath. She slammed both hands down on the desk, leaning over the monitors. Do you know who I am? I am Melanie Vance. You are a glorified bank teller. You will wire that money right now, or I will buy this entire bank and fire you myself, Mrs. Vance. I must ask you to lower your voice, David warned, standing up. I will not lower my voice, Melanie shrieked, grabbing a heavy crystal paperweight from his desk and hurling it against the wall. It shattered with a loud, violent crash. I want my money. Give me my money. The sound of shattering crystal brought the entire bank lobby to a dead halt. Tellers stopped counting cash. Clients turned away from the counters. Melanie stormed out of the office and into the center of the lobby, her face contorted with pure rage. She was screaming, pacing back and forth across the marble floor. This bank is stealing my money. They are colluding with a kidnapper. Do you see how they treat their best clients? Every single person in the lobby pulled out their smartphone. Half a dozen cameras were suddenly pointed directly at her, recording every second of the spectacular meltdown. The viral cancellation she had tried to orchestrate against me was now happening to her in real time. People whispered. People pointed. The wealthy snob, the woman who had just posted a tearful victim video 24 hours ago, was now throwing a violent, screaming tantrum in a public bank. Ma'am, you need to leave the premises immediately. Two large uniformed security guards stepped in front of her, forming a physical barrier between her and the recording public. You are causing a major disturbance. Walk toward the exit, or we will physically remove you and call the police. Melanie looked at the guards. She looked at the circle of glowing phone screens recording her humiliation. She looked back at David Sterling, who was already picking up his desk phone to call the authorities. She grabbed her Birkin bag, her chest heaving with ragged, panicked breaths. She turned on her heel and fled toward the heavy glass doors running from the lobby in absolute crushing disgrace. 10 miles away in a luxurious high-rise apartment, Terrence was pacing holes into his expensive Persian rug. He was ignoring the chaotic news alerts about his wife's public meltdown. He had bigger, far more terrifying problems. His cell phone rang. The caller ID flashed the name of his lead criminal defense attorney. Terrence snatched the phone, his palms sweating. "Tell me the wire transfer cleared," Terrence demanded, his voice cracking with anxiety. "Tell me Melanie got the money." Terrence the lawyer said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual arrogant bluster. "We have a massive problem. The money does not matter right now. The FBI just called me. They are upgrading your charges. They just filed a superseding indictment against you." "What?" Terrence gasped, stopping dead in his tracks. "On what grounds?" "Because they have absolutely everything now," the lead lawyer replied, sounding genuinely afraid. 10 minutes ago, the federal prosecutor received a completely anonymous, heavily encrypted data dump. It contained a pristine, flawless paper trail. It showed every single offshore shell company, every hidden LLC, and every single fraudulent wire transfer you secretly executed over the last 5 years. They have the routing numbers. They have the specific IP addresses. Whoever compiled this dossier is a financial ghost, and they just handed the federal government the exact bullets needed to put you away for the rest of your entire natural life. The evening air in the affluent Chicago suburb was crisp, but inside Richard and Patricia's sprawling estate, the atmosphere was suffocatingly warm and dripping with artificial elegance. Despite the catastrophic events unfolding around their daughter and son-in-law, my parents had absolutely refused to cancel their long-planned charity committee dinner. For Richard and Patricia, maintaining the flawless facade of untouchable wealth was far more important than addressing actual reality. They had spent the entire afternoon frantically spinning Melanie's public bank meltdown as a simple banking error caused by incompetent staff. They assured their wealthy friends that Terrence was merely dealing with standard corporate audits. 12 of the most influential socialites and business moguls in their circle sat around the massive mahogany dining table. Crystal wine glasses gleamed brightly under the light of the imported chandelier. Patricia held court at one end of the table, wearing a sapphire evening gown that probably cost more than my first car. She laughed a high musical sound that felt entirely hollow. She directed the conversation away from anything related to finance or family, focusing entirely on their upcoming winter trip to Aspen and the renovations they planned for the east wing of the house. Richard sat at the opposite end swirling an expensive scotch. He projected the image of a seasoned patriarch confidently discussing golf courses and local politics. He was actively ignoring the fact that his son-in-law had secretly leveraged the very roof over their heads. He truly believed his sheer arrogance could hold the crumbling walls of his life together. The hired catering staff moved silently around the room, clearing the appetizer plates. Patricia raised her glass to propose a toast to their guests. She began speaking about the importance of community and standing strong together. The heavy oak front door shuddered under a series of loud, aggressive knocks. The sound echoed through the grand foyer and sliced right through Patricia's elegant toast. The guests paused, exchanging confused glances. In their neighborhood, visitors did not pound on doors after 8 o'clock at night. Richard frowned, gesturing sharply to the hired butler to handle the disturbance. He offered a tight, forced smile to his guests, apologizing for the interruption and blaming it on a confused delivery driver. The quiet murmur of the dining room was suddenly shattered by the sound of a scuffle in the foyer. The heavy doors swung open, hitting the wall with a loud crack. A man in a cheap, rumpled gray suit pushed his way past the protesting butler. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps directly into the formal dining room. He did not look intimidated by the wealth or the staring socialites. He looked like a man who had a job to do. Richard stood up immediately, his face flushing with dark, explosive anger. "What is the meaning of this? You are trespassing on private property. Get out of my house before I call the police." The man stopped at the head of the table. He looked at a clipboard in his hand, then looked directly at my father. "Are you Richard Vance?" "I am, and I am telling you to leave immediately." The man did not blink. He reached into his battered leather messenger bag and pulled out a massive, intimidating stack of legal documents bound by thick rubber bands. He slammed the entire stack right onto the center of the immaculate dining table, nearly knocking over a silver candelabra. "Richard Vance, you have been officially served." Patricia gasped loudly. The delicate crystal wine glass slipped from her manicured fingers. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. Dark red wine splashed across the pristine Persian rug like a fresh wound. The entire table went dead silent. The wealthy guests stared in absolute shock. The illusion of perfection was instantly destroyed. "What is this garbage?" Richard roared, his voice booming through the room. He pointed a shaking finger at the process server. "I will sue you for harassment. I will have you arrested right now." The process server offered a grim, unsympathetic smile. "You can try. Those are immediate foreclosure and eviction notices. Your secondary mortgage went into default 3 days ago. The original lender liquidated the debt this morning. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises before the county sheriff arrives to forcibly remove you and padlock the doors. Have a pleasant evening." The man turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving a trail of absolute devastation in his wake. The silence that followed was suffocating. The guests began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A few of the women avoided making eye contact with Patricia, who was staring at the spilled wine as if she had just seen a ghost. The socialites were already whispering. The rumors would spread through their exclusive country clubs before midnight. Richard and Patricia Vance were bankrupt. They were being thrown out of their home, Richard grabbed the thick stack of papers, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and absolute panic. "This is a massive mistake," he blustered, looking around at his guests with a frantic, desperate smile. "It is a clerical error. The bank made a massive mistake. I will have this completely sorted out with one phone call in the morning. Please, everyone, enjoy your dinner." No one moved. The damage was done. Two couples at the end of the table abruptly stood up, muttering awkward excuses about an early morning flight and an emergency babysitter text. The mass exodus had begun. They were fleeing the sinking ship. Patricia sank into her chair, her hands covering her face. She was completely broken, her social standing obliterated in front of the very people she desperately wanted to impress. Richard ignored the departing guests. He ripped the rubber bands off the legal documents, scanning the dense jargon for a name. The private equity firm holding his debt was Vanguard Capital. He had no idea it was Allison. The morning sun offered absolutely no warmth as my family frantically piled into Richard's leased Mercedes SUV. The fallout from the dinner party eviction notice had shattered their carefully constructed reality. By 8 o'clock, their panic had mutated into a toxic, desperate rage. They were driving straight into downtown Chicago, hunting down the corporate headquarters of Vanguard Capital. Richard gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning stark white as he aggressively wove through heavy city traffic. He was entirely convinced that a face-to-face intimidation tactic would instantly resolve his catastrophic financial ruin. He believed the private equity firm had made a colossal administrative error, and that a display of his traditional patriarchal authority would immediately force them to reverse the foreclosure. In the passenger seat, Patricia was clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver. She spent the entire drive obsessively checking her phone, watching in absolute horror as the country club group chats erupted with vicious gossip about their public humiliation the night before. In the back seat, Melanie was aggressively tapping her phone screen, her face flushed with fresh outrage. She had just attempted to buy a $7 iced latte only to have 3 different platinum credit cards violently declined in front of a line of morning commuters. Terrence sat beside her, sweating profusely into the collar of his tailored suit. He was silently calculating how many years in a federal penitentiary he was currently facing, but he maintained a mask of arrogant annoyance for the benefit of his in-laws. Richard pulled the vehicle illegally into a reserved loading zone right outside the towering glass and steel monolith that housed Vanguard Capital. He did not care about the aggressive security guard shouting at him. He marched toward the revolving doors like a monarch preparing to discipline his unruly subjects. Patricia, Melanie, and Terrence followed closely behind, forming a miserable phalanx of misplaced entitlement. They stepped into the cavernous, ultra-modern lobby. The sheer scale of the wealth radiating from the imported Italian marble floors and towering modern art installations temporarily stunned them. This was not a regional bank branch. This was an apex financial predator. Richard quickly shook off his hesitation, puffing out his chest and storming directly toward the expansive reception desk. "I need to speak with the managing partner immediately," Richard demanded, slamming his palm flat on the polished granite counter. "My name is Richard Vance. Your firm has made a catastrophic legal error regarding my property. You bought a fraudulent debt and you are going to cancel that eviction notice right now before I sue this entire building into absolute oblivion." The receptionist looked up, her expression a mask of flawless corporate neutrality. She did not flinch at his aggressive tone. She had received my specific instructions 30 minutes prior. She offered a polite, icy smile. "Mr. Vance, we have been expecting you. The executive team is waiting for you in the main boardroom on the 54th floor. Please take the private elevator to your right." Richard scoffed loudly, turning back to his family with a triumphant, sickening smirk. "You see," he boasted, adjusting his silk tie. "They know exactly who I am. They realize they messed up. We just need to go up there, show them we are not intimidated, and crush them." They stepped into the private glass-walled elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing them in a quiet, ascending cube. As the elevator rapidly shot upward, scaling the Chicago skyline, their collective arrogance reached a fever pitch. "I am going to demand an immediate public apology," Patricia stated firmly, checking her reflection in the mirrored panel. "I want a formal retraction sent to the country club board. They cannot treat established families like common criminals. Melanie crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing with vindictive anticipation. Forget the apology. I am demanding severe financial compensation for emotional distress. That little bank manager completely humiliated me yesterday. I want him fired and I want my trust fund unfrozen before lunch. These corporate vultures need to learn. They cannot just freeze $10 million because some pathetic relative of ours filed a fake injunction. Terrence wiped his sweaty forehead with a silk handkerchief. Let me handle the talking, Richard. I understand how these private equity sharks operate. I will offer them a fractional settlement on your mortgage debt. We give them a small percentage of the trust fund to make the federal charges disappear, and we walk away clean. They just want a quick payout. They are completely spineless when you push back hard enough. Richard nodded approvingly. Exactly. We walk in there, we dictate our terms, and we crush them. Nobody disrespects the Vance family. The elevator chimed a soft melodic note. The digital display flashed the number 54. The doors smoothly parted, revealing a breathtaking executive reception area. The thick plush carpet absorbed the sound of their confident footsteps. A silent assistant gestured toward a set of massive frosted glass double doors at the end of the corridor. Richard took a deep breath, puffed out his chest, and shoved the heavy doors open without knocking. He marched into the boardroom, absolutely ready to unleash hell. Patricia, Melanie, and Terrence marched in right behind him, their chins raised in perfect, synchronized defiance. The boardroom was cavernous and flooded with natural light from floor to ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The long mahogany table was empty except for the far end. 5 elite corporate lawyers dressed in immaculate dark suits stood silently like an impenetrable wall of legal warfare. They were flanking a high-backed black leather executive chair that was turned away from the door facing the panoramic view of the city. Listen to me carefully, Richard barked. Turn around right now and look at me. The heavy chair slowly swiveled around. I was sitting there wearing a $5,000 tailored suit. My expression was pure ice. I looked directly into Richard's deeply horrified eyes. Hello, my family. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The arrogant bluster that had carried him up 54 floors completely evaporated, replaced by paralyzing confusion. Melanie gripped the mahogany table, processing the impossible sight of her invisible sister sitting at the apex of a financial empire. Terrence understood first. He looked from my tailored suit to the corporate litigators behind me. The color drained from his face. You, Terrence whispered, his voice trembling. Vanguard Capital, it was you. You bought the debt. You bought the... I remained still, radiating the calculated authority of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. David stepped forward and placed 4 leather binders on the table. He slid them in front of each family member. Open them, I commanded. The tone left no room for debate. It was not the voice of the quiet aunt they bullied at holiday dinners. It was the voice of the executive who had just liquidated their entire existence. Richard mounted a pathetic defense. He slammed his hand flat against the leather binder. This is a sick joke, Allison. I do not know how you scammed your way into this chair, but you are completely out of your depth. You will call off this fraudulent foreclosure right now, or I swear I will have you arrested for extortion. I picked up my porcelain coffee cup, taking a deliberate sip. I am not the one facing federal prison, Richard. Open the damn folder. Richard yanked the cover open. His eyes darted across the highlighted paragraphs, trying to decipher the complex financial terminology. Patricia leaned over his shoulder, her breath hitching as she saw the official bank seals. Let me translate that for you, I said. Your primary residence, the mansion you love to brag about, is gone. The secondary mortgage went into catastrophic default. Vanguard Capital purchased that debt and we are executing an immediate foreclosure. You have less than 48 hours to pack your bags before the sheriffs physically remove you from the premises. You are completely bankrupt. Patricia let out a high wail, clutching her chest. This is impossible. We never took out a second mortgage. Our home has been paid off for 15 years. Richard glared at me. You forged this. You fabricated these documents to steal our home. I shook my head. I did not forge anything, but someone else in this room certainly did. I shifted my gaze to Terrence, who was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. I slid a separate folder across the table. It stopped inches from Terrence's shaking hands. Tell them, Terrence. Tell your devoted in-laws exactly how you secured the capital to artificially inflate your failing venture firm. Tell them how you paid for Melanie's designer wardrobe and your luxury cars. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Terrence refused to speak. He just stared at the transparent folder as if it contained a live explosive. I will explain it, I announced. 3 weeks ago, your golden son-in-law forged both of your signatures on a comprehensive power of attorney document. He used that fraudulent authorization to secretly leverage your entire estate. He took out a massive second mortgage against your home to cover his mounting legal debts and secure his own bail money. He literally stole the roof over your heads to save himself, and you spent the morning screaming at me to hand over my niece and nephew. Richard slowly turned to look at Terrence. The patriarch's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The realization struck him with physical force. The man he had championed, the man he had constantly compared me against, was the architect of his total destruction. "You stole my house!" Richard roared, his voice cracking with fury. Terrence threw his hands up, backing away from the table. "Richard, listen to me. It was a temporary liquidity measure. I was going to pay it back as soon as the new funding round closed. I am family." Richard did not care about corporate excuses. He lunged across the mahogany chairs, grabbing Terrence by the collar of his silk shirt. "You parasitic thief, you ruined me!" Richard screamed, slamming Terrence against the glass wall. My security detail instinctively stepped forward, but I raised a single hand signaling them to stop. I sat back in my executive chair, sipping my coffee, watching the monsters tear each other apart. Patricia turned her vicious outrage toward Melanie. "Did you know about this?" Patricia shrieked, grabbing Melanie by the shoulder and shaking her violently. "Did you know your husband was stealing our home?" Melanie slapped her mother's hands away, her own face twisted in frantic desperation. "I did not know anything. He told me the business was thriving. He told me the federal probe was a misunderstanding. You cannot blame me." She spun around, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You did this, Allison. You set us up. You enjoyed destroying us. You are a spiteful, jealous failure. You think you won because you took our house and froze my bank accounts. But you forgot the most important piece of the puzzle." Melanie leaned over the table, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with cornered desperation. "We have the family court hearing tomorrow morning. The judge will see a loving mother fighting for her children. I will get full custody of Leo and Mia before noon. And the second those children are back in my house, I gain total administrative control over Theodore's $10 million trust. I will use my children's money to pay off the debt, destroy this injunction, and bankrupt your miserable private equity firm. You hear me? I will get my babies, and I will get my millions." I set my coffee cup down with a soft, definitive clink. I looked at her frantic face and allowed a slow, chilling smirk to spread across my lips. "See you in court." The heavy oak doors of the family court swung shut, sealing out the chaotic noise of the crowded hallway. The courtroom was a sterile theater of polished wood and harsh fluorescent lighting. At the elevated bench sat Judge Evelyn Carter, a woman with a reputation that preceded her. She was notoriously strict, entirely unsympathetic to emotional outbursts, and vehemently biased toward maintaining biological family units whenever legally possible. She adjusted her reading glasses and stared down at the two opposing legal teams. Melanie sat at the plaintiff table, radiating the perfect illusion of a heartbroken, desperate mother. She wore a modest, pale blue dress, her makeup intentionally muted to highlight the dark circles under her eyes. She clutched a crumpled tissue, occasionally dabbing at the dry corners of her eyes. Beside her sat Arthur Pendleton, an expensive and ruthless family law attorney in Chicago. At the defense table, I sat perfectly still in a tailored charcoal suit. My legal team, led by Diana Chen, flanked me. We were calm. We were prepared. Judge Carter struck her gavel once. "Court is now in session. We are here to review the emergency custody injunction regarding Leo and Mia Vance." Mr. Pendleton, you filed the petition to dissolve the temporary guardianship currently held by the Aunt Allison Vance. You have the floor. Arthur Pendleton stood buttoning his suit jacket. He walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom, exuding a masterful blend of righteous indignation and sorrow. Thank you, Your Honor. What we have here today is a tragic misrepresentation of facts orchestrated by a highly vindictive and financially aggressive relative. My client, Melanie Vance, is a devoted, loving mother who has been subjected to a hostile corporate takeover of her own family. Pendleton gestured gracefully toward Melanie, who let out a perfectly timed, stifled sob. 3 weeks ago, my client's husband faced sudden, highly publicized legal complications. In a moment of absolute panic, acting entirely out of an instinct to protect her young children from a media circus, my client made a temporary arrangement. She left her children in the care of her sister Allison. It was a lapse in administrative judgment, certainly. She did not file formal temporary guardianship papers because she trusted her own flesh and blood. She believed she was shielding her children from the devastating stress of a federal investigation. Pendleton turned his gaze toward me, his voice hardening into a sharp, accusatory weapon. But how did Allison repay that sisterly trust? She weaponized it. Your Honor. Allison Vance is the CEO of Vanguard Capital. She is a woman who deals in hostile takeovers, liquidations, and absolute ruthlessness. She has brought that exact corporate warfare into this family. She did not just take the children. She orchestrated a calculated financial siege against her own parents and her sister. He stepped closer to the judge's bench, leaning in to deliver his most damaging blow. And we must ask why. Why would a woman who has historically shown zero interest in maternal responsibilities suddenly launch a legal war to steal her niece and nephew? The answer is tragically simple: money and jealousy. There is a $10 million trust established by the children's late grandfather. Control of the children dictates control of that massive trust. Allison Vance discovered she was infertile years ago. She is a bitter, barren woman who realized she could never build a family of her own. So she decided to buy one, seizing control of my client's children to access a $10 million fortune, while simultaneously satisfying a lifelong pathological jealousy against her successful sister. The courtroom was dead silent. Pendleton's delivery was magnetic. He had successfully painted me not as a savior, but as a wealthy, barren corporate shark buying a family to satisfy a vendetta. Melanie wept openly now, burying her face in her hands. Pendleton placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Your Honor. The biological bond between a mother and her children is sacred. My client made a brief scheduling error during a family crisis. She left her children for 2 weeks. She did not abandon them. She placed them in a safe home, expecting them to be returned the moment the dust settled. Instead, she was locked out, financially ruined, and blocked from seeing her own babies by a sister utilizing unlimited corporate resources to bully a desperate mother. We respectfully request that the emergency guardianship be immediately dissolved and full custody be restored to the biological mother right now. Pendleton returned to his seat. The performance was flawless. Judge Carter stared down from the bench, her expression heavy with deliberation. She looked over at my table, and I could see the distinct shift in her eyes. The narrative had worked. In the eyes of the court, the immense financial disparity between Melanie and me was glaring. A billionaire private equity CEO swooping in to take children from a mother whose assets had just been frozen looked exactly like bullying. Judge Carter folded her hands together. The court takes the biological rights of a mother very seriously. Financial superiority does not grant anyone the right to bypass parental sovereignty. Ms. Vance, I must admit the timeline and the aggressive financial actions your firm has taken against the plaintiff's family cast a very troubling shadow over your motivations here today. I am heavily inclined to restore custody to the biological mother immediately. Melanie gasped loudly. She squeezed Pendleton's arm and shot me a venomous, triumphant glare across the aisle. She truly thought she had won. She thought the $10 million was securely back in her grasp. Judge Carter turned her stern gaze to my lead attorney. Miss Chen, I will hear your rebuttal now. Diana Chen stood up slowly. She smoothed the front of her dark suit jacket. She did not exhibit a single ounce of panic. She calmly walked forward, looked directly at Melanie, and handed the bailiff a thin folder. The defense submits Exhibit A, she stated clearly. Diana handed the folder to the bailiff. Inside was a flash drive. He walked it to the bench. Judge Carter looked at the drive before passing it to the clerk to load into the audio system. Arthur Pendleton scoffed from the plaintiff table, adjusting his tie. He whispered into Melanie and her ear. She nodded, forcing a defiant smile, her knuckles white where she gripped the table. Diana folded her hands. Your Honor? She began, her voice ringing across the silent courtroom. Opposing counsel painted a moving portrait of a desperate mother making a minor scheduling error during a crisis. They claim my client, Allison Vance, is acting out of malice to steal a family, but facts are stubborn things. The defense submits Exhibit A. This is an audio recording captured by the camera positioned above the front porch of Allison and her residence. The timestamp confirms this was captured at exactly 6:42 on the morning the children were abandoned. Melanie and her forced smile vanished. Terrence, sitting directly behind his wife, sat up straight, his face draining of color. He knew exactly what had happened on that porch. He knew how loud they had yelled. Play the audio file, Judge Carter ordered. The clerk clicked a button. The speakers hummed to life. First, there was only the crisp sound of morning wind and the crunching of leather soles on a walkway. Then came the unmistakable, frantic rattling of luggage wheels being dragged across pavement. The sounds painted a vivid picture of a panicked retreat. Then the crying began. It was not a soft whimper. It was the desperate, terrified wailing of two young children abruptly woken up in the dark and dragged out of their home. The high-pitched sobs of Mia echoed through the speakers, followed by little Leo asking where they were going. Hearing their tiny voices fill the legal chamber made the air feel colder. Then came Melanie and her voice. It was not the soft, victimized tone she had weaponized moments ago. It was sharp, vicious, and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. The audio enhancement stripped away the wind, leaving her words naked and undeniable. I do not care if they cry, Melanie. And her recorded voice shrieked, slicing through the silence of the courtroom like a razor blade. These brats are just a meal ticket, but right now they are slowing us down. Dump them and let us go. I am not going to prison for sloppy accounting, Terrence. The recording captured the heavy thud of a car door slamming shut, the revving of an engine, and the squeal of tires speeding away, leaving the sound of two weeping toddlers standing alone on a freezing porch. The clerk paused it. The silence that descended upon the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. It was a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. The narrative of the devoted mother did not just crack. It violently exploded into unrecoverable pieces. Judge Carter sat perfectly rigid. Her face had turned to absolute stone. The strict demeanor she maintained was suddenly laced with a palpable disgust. She stared down at Melanie with a look of profound contempt. The judge had spent the last hour listening to Arthur Pendleton weave a tragic tale of maternal devotion, and now the undeniable truth lay exposed. Melanie had not made a scheduling error. She dumped her children like excess baggage to flee a federal indictment. At the plaintiff table, the transformation was catastrophic. Melanie sank into her heavy leather chair. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickly ashen gray. Her jaw hung open, her glossed lips trembling as she stared blankly at the floor. The weeping mother facade was completely stripped away, leaving only the hollow reality of a woman caught in the ultimate lie. She could not look at the judge. She could not look at her lawyer. She seemed to shrink, folding inward under the crushing weight of her own recorded cruelty. In the gallery, the fallout was equally destructive. Terrence sat frozen, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. He stared at the back of his wife and her head as the words echoed in his mind. I am not going to prison for sloppy accounting. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow. Throughout this entire ordeal, he believed they were a team fighting a joint legal battle. But the recording revealed the absolute truth. Melanie was perfectly willing to let him take the fall. She had viewed him not as a partner, but as a scapegoat. The golden couple, the untouchable socialites, were imploding in real time. Arthur Pendleton was a seasoned legal shark, but even he looked sickened for a fraction of a second. However, an expensive retainer demanded action. He scrambled to recover his shattered case. He leaped to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the polished floor. His face was flushed red with panic and manufactured outrage. "Objection!" Pendleton shouted, his voice echoing loudly in the tense room. "Objection, Your Honor. I demand this audio be struck from the record immediately. This is a blatant, illegal wiretap." My client had a reasonable expectation of privacy when speaking to her husband. Opposing counsel submitted an illegally obtained recording that violates state and federal surveillance laws. This is fruit of the poisonous tree and cannot be considered by this court. Judge Carter leaned forward, her eyes blazing with absolute fury. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the sounding block with a deafening crack that made Melanie physically jump in her seat. "Overruled," Judge Carter barked, her voice dripping with venomous authority. "That audio was captured on the front porch of a private residence, Mr. Pendleton. Your client was shouting at the top of her lungs on a public-facing walkway. There is zero reasonable expectation of privacy when you are screaming on someone else and their front doorstep. The exhibit is admitted." Judge Carter slammed her gavel down one final time, her voice echoing with absolute finality. "The exhibit is admitted." She turned her piercing gaze toward the defense table. "Miss Chen, you may call your next witness." Diana Chen stood tall, her voice ringing clear through the dead silence of the courtroom. "The defense calls Allison Vance to the stand." I stood up from my leather chair. I did not look at my parents, who were sitting frozen in the gallery. I did not look at Terrence, who was sweating through his collar. And I certainly did not look at Melanie, who was staring at the floor in absolute crushing defeat. I walked to the witness stand with steady, measured steps. I raised my right hand, swore to tell the whole truth, and took my seat. I was not here to play the victim. I was here to be the executioner. Diana stepped up to the podium. "Miss Vance, could you please describe for the court exactly what happened on the morning of November 12th? I looked directly at Judge Carter. I wanted her to see the absolute sincerity in my eyes. I woke up at 6:45 in the morning to the sound of my doorbell ringing frantically. When I opened the front door, I did not find my sister asking for a favor. I found my 5-year-old nephew and my 3-year-old niece standing on my freezing porch in their pajamas. They were shivering. They were sobbing. And they were clutching 3 black plastic trash bags stuffed with a random assortment of clothing. There was no note. There was no phone call. There was just the taillights of a Mercedes SUV speeding away into the dawn. I paused, letting the brutal reality of that image sink into the silent courtroom. My attorney asked me to describe the children's condition over the past 3 weeks. The financial details of this case are irrelevant compared to the psychological damage inflicted on those 2 innocent children, I stated, keeping my voice steady, but infused with protective fury. For the first 4 nights, Leo wet the bed. He had never done that before. He would wake up screaming, asking why his mommy threw him away like garbage. Mia stopped speaking entirely for a week. She just carried around a torn teddy bear she pulled from one of those trash bags, waiting by the front window for a car that never came. They were completely discarded. They were treated like radioactive liabilities because their parents were fleeing a federal indictment. Melanie's lawyer, Arthur Pendleton, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew he had completely lost control of the narrative. I turned my attention fully to the judge. Your Honor, opposing counsel stood here and called me a bitter, barren woman trying to buy a family. He is half right. I cannot have children of my own. But that biological reality does not diminish my capacity for maternal love. It amplifies it. I look at Leo and Mia and I see 2 brilliant, beautiful children who deserve absolute stability, unconditional love, and a home where they are not viewed as a strategic financial asset. My sister looks at her children and sees a $10 million trust fund. She sees a human shield to hide behind in family court. She sees a meal ticket, I see my family." Judge Carter leaned forward. The legendary stone-faced jurist had visibly softened. The rigid lines around her mouth relaxed, and she watched me with a look of profound, undeniable respect. It was the exact opposite of Melanie's fabricated theatrical weeping. I was not asking for sympathy. I was demanding justice for two abandoned toddlers. Miss Vance, Judge Carter asked gently, "What exactly are you petitioning this court to do today?" I sat up perfectly straight, resting my hands on the wooden railing of the witness box. "I am officially requesting that this court strip Melanie and Terrence Vance of all parental rights effective immediately and permanently. They have demonstrated catastrophic negligence, profound emotional abuse, and extreme flight risk. Furthermore, I am requesting an immediate ironclad injunction on the grandfather's trust. I want that $10 million locked down in an impenetrable blind account. Neither I nor my sister nor my parents will have any access to a single cent. The funds must be completely frozen and preserved exclusively for Leo and Mia until they reach their 18th birthdays. If Melanie truly wants her children back because she loves them, she can fight for them without the motivation of a $10 million payout. But we all know she will not do that, because without the money, they are just baggage slowing her down." Melanie let out a choked, desperate gasp. The realization that the money was slipping through her fingers completely broke her. She lunged forward against the plaintiff table, her face contorted with raw, unfiltered greed. "You cannot do that!" she screamed, completely abandoning any pretense of maternal grace. "That is my money. Theodore promised me that money to raise them. You have no right to lock it away." Judge Carter slammed her gavel down her face, turning crimson with absolute disgust. "Sit down and remain silent. Mrs. Vance or I will have you removed in handcuffs." The judge turned back to me, taking a deep breath to compose her ruling. "The court has heard enough. Based on the audio evidence presented, the clear financial motivations of the plaintiff, and the disturbing testimony regarding the children's physical abandonment, I am prepared to issue my ruling." Before Judge Carter could strike her gavel to finalize the permanent destruction of Melanie's life, a massive commotion erupted in the hallway. The heavy, reinforced oak doors of the courtroom suddenly burst open with a violent, echoing crash. Two stern FBI agents walked directly in, holding up an official arrest warrant for Terrence, completely stopping the entire legal proceeding, absolutely cold in its tracks right now. The heavy footsteps of the federal agents echoed like a death knell across the polished hardwood floor. The lead agent, a tall man with a jaw carved from granite, did not even glance at the gallery. His eyes were locked entirely on the defense table. Or rather, the plaintiff table where Terrence had wedged himself behind his wife. Judge Carter raised her hand, her voice cutting through the sudden uproar. "State your business in my courtroom immediately." The lead agent held up his badge, the gold shield catching the harsh fluorescent light. "Special Agent Miller, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a federal arrest warrant for Terrence Vance." Terrence stopped breathing. His face, already pale from the devastating audio recording, turned the color of wet ash. He tried to stand, his knees knocking against the heavy wooden table, but his legs completely refused to support his weight. He slumped back down, his mouth opening and closing in a desperate, silent panic. Agent Miller did not wait for an invitation to proceed. He bypassed the wooden partition, marching directly up to the plaintiff table. "Terrence Vance, you are under arrest for 2 counts of federal wire fraud, 1 count of aggravated corporate forgery and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. Stand up and put your hands behind your back." The courtroom erupted. The carefully maintained silence shattered into a million pieces of absolute chaos. Reporters in the back row scrambled for their phones, their thumbs flying across screens to break the news that the golden boy of Chicago finance was being detained in open court. Arthur Pendleton, the high-priced lawyer who had spent the last hour defending this family, instantly stepped away from Terrence. Pendleton was a shark, and sharks did not bleed for their clients. He raised his hands in a gesture of complete surrender, legally and physically distancing himself from the sinking ship. Terrence raised his shaking hands, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "There is a mistake. You have the wrong man. I am a victim here. My company was restructuring. It was a liquidity issue. I was going to pay it back. Agent Miller grabbed Terrence by the shoulder, hauling him to his feet with effortless, terrifying strength. The time for corporate buzzwords is over, Mr. Vance. Turn around. That was the moment Melanie snapped. The illusion of the devoted, heartbroken mother completely evaporated, replaced instantly by the vicious, self-preserving predator she truly was. She scrambled backward, her chair tipping over and crashing loudly onto the floor. She pressed herself against the wooden railing, putting as much physical distance between herself and her husband as humanly possible. "Get your hands off me, Terrence!" Melanie shrieked, batting away his flailing arm as he reached out for her. She turned her manicured finger toward him, her face twisted in a mask of absolute revulsion. "I had nothing to do with this, Your Honor. Listen to me. He lied to me. He told me the business was fine. He forged those documents behind my back. I am a mother. I am completely innocent." She was throwing him to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. It was the exact same survival instinct that made her abandon her crying children on my freezing porch. Melanie only cared about Melanie. Terrence froze. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed sharply, but it was Melanie's betrayal that truly immobilized him. He stared at his wife. He stared at the woman he had stolen, lied for, and ultimately ruined himself for. The sheer audacity of her denial broke the final tether of his sanity. Spite, hot and venomous, flooded his eyes. "Innocent!" Terrence roared, his voice tearing through the courtroom. His pristine silk tie was askew. His designer suit rumpled as the second agent secured his arms. "You parasitic liar! You knew exactly where the money came from." Agent Miller began reading the Miranda rights, his voice a steady drone beneath the screaming match. "You have the right to remain silent." But Terrence refused to remain silent. He thrashed against the federal agents, twisting his neck to look directly at the judge, then at me, and finally at the gallery. "She was my co-conspirator," Terrence bellowed, spitting the words with vicious delight. "She signed the Cayman Island transfer authorizations. She is the one who hired the offshore accountant. When the subpoena dropped, she was the one who packed the bags and said we needed to run. She knew everything. Arrest her. Arrest my wife." Melanie covered her ears, screaming for him to shut up, her voice pitching into a hysterical, unhinged wail. In the second row of the gallery, the true casualty of this spectacle was unfolding. Richard and Patricia sat paralyzed. The patriarch of the family, the man who had constantly measured my worth against the monumental success of his golden son-in-law, watched his entire legacy burn to ash. Richard clutched his chest, his breathing shallow and rapid. The country club memberships, the charity galas, the pristine social standing in their elite circles, all of it was gone. He was watching the man he had championed get dragged away in steel chains for stealing their primary residence and defrauding federal banks. Patricia was weeping openly, but not out of sorrow. She was weeping from the sheer, unadulterated mortification of public ruin. The high society matron was witnessing her perfect daughter scream like a cornered animal while her son-in-law confessed to federal crimes on the public record. They were ruined. Completely, utterly, and irreversibly ruined. Agent Miller shoved Terrence forward, forcing him to march down the center aisle. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Miller finished his grip, unyielding. Terrence dragged his feet, his head swiveling back to spit one last curse at Melanie before the heavy oak doors swallowed him whole, slamming shut with a definitive thud. The aftermath was a scene of absolute devastation. Melanie was hyperventilating, collapsed against the plaintiff table, her hands clutching her perfectly styled hair. Arthur Pendleton was already packing his leather briefcase, aggressively avoiding eye contact with the woman who could clearly no longer afford his hourly rate. At the defense table, I remained perfectly seated. My hands were folded neatly in my lap. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the inevitable consequence of their greed play out exactly as I knew it would. I had not destroyed them. I merely handed them the rope, and they had eagerly tied the noose themselves, Judge Evelyn Carter stood up behind the elevated bench. Her face was a mask of terrifying judicial wrath. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a series of violent echoing cracks that silenced the whispering gallery and forced Melanie to look up through her panicked tears. "Order," Judge Carter thundered, her voice shaking the very walls of the courtroom. "I demand absolute order in my courtroom this instant." The remaining murmurs instantly died. The heavy, suffocating silence returned thicker and more oppressive than before. Judge Carter adjusted her robes, her eyes locking onto Melanie with a cold, unforgiving stare. She arranged the documents on her desk, aligning them with meticulous precision. "Counsel, take your seats," Judge Carter commanded, her tone dropping to a dangerous, quiet authority. "The spectacle is over. This court has heard the testimony. This court has reviewed the evidence. And this court is now fully prepared to deliver its final binding ruling regarding the permanent custody of Leo and Mia Vance and the immediate disposition of the $10 million trust." Judge Evelyn Carter let the echo of her gavel fade into the high vaulted ceiling of the courtroom. The heavy silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. She looked down from the bench, her eyes locked onto my sister with an intensity that felt like a physical strike. I remained seated at the defense table, my posture perfect, my breathing steady. I watched the arrogant, entitled shell of Melanie Vance completely fracture. "Mrs. Vance," Judge Carter began, her voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute attention. "In my 22 years presiding over this family court, I have seen every variation of human failing. I have seen addiction, poverty, and blinding desperation drive parents to make terrible, tragic choices. But what I have witnessed in this courtroom today is an entirely different breed of catastrophe. It is a cold, calculated malice that defies all comprehension." Melanie sat trembling, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles were entirely white. She looked to her left, seeking a lifeline, but Arthur Pendleton was already snapping the brass locks of his leather briefcase shut. He did not even glance in her direction. His retainer was depleted. His case was destroyed, and he was physically stepping away from the blast radius. "You did not abandon your children because you were scared," Judge Carter continued, leaning forward over the bench. "You abandoned them because they were inconvenient to your escape. You placed 2 toddlers on a freezing porch in the middle of the night with nothing but trash bags. You did not even have the maternal decency to knock on the door and ensure they were safely received. You drove away to save yourself. You treated your own flesh and blood like disposable assets to be discarded when they became a liability and reclaimed only when they became a meal ticket. You are without question one of the most profoundly unfit mothers I have ever encountered in my career on the bench." A harsh, ragged gasp escaped Melanie's throat. She shook her head frantically, but no words came out. The performative tears she had utilized earlier were completely gone, replaced by the stark, wide-eyed terror of a predator caught in a trap of its own making. Judge Carter did not give her a second to breathe. She picked up a stack of legal documents and raised her pen. "I am dissolving the temporary injunction immediately. Furthermore, based on the undeniable evidence of physical abandonment, emotional abuse, and extreme flight risk, I am officially stripping you, Melanie Vance, and your husband, Terrence Vance, of all parental rights." The words hit the room like a localized earthquake. Melanie flinched as if she had been struck across the face. "I am granting full permanent legal and physical custody of Leo and Mia Vance to their aunt Allison Vance," the judge declared, her pen scratching sharply across the heavy paper. "The court recognizes Miss Vance as the sole protective force in these children's lives. She has provided stability, security, and the unconditional care that their biological parents utterly failed to deliver." Melanie's chest heaved. But the judge was not finished. Regarding the financial petition, Judge Carter stated, her voice slicing through the heavy air. "The $10 million trust established by the late grandfather was intended for the welfare and future of Leo and Mia. Leaving those funds accessible to you, Mrs. Vance, would result in their immediate liquidation to fund your legal defense or your personal escape. That will not happen. I am permanently transferring full administrative control of the $10 million trust to Allison Vance acting as the sole trustee. The funds will be placed in an impenetrable locked account. You are legally severed from this money, Mrs. Vance. You will not have access to a single dime. That was the breaking point. The loss of her children had elicited a gasp, but the loss of the money completely shattered her mind. No, Melanie shrieked a raw, guttural scream that tore through her throat. She leaped up from her chair, her face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly greed. You cannot do that. That is my money. Theodore promised me that money to raise them. You cannot give it to her. She will steal it. I need that money for my lawyers. She was not crying for Leo. She was not crying for Mia. She was crying for the bank accounts. Real hysterical tears streamed down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup as she lunged toward the bench. Two court bailiffs immediately stepped forward, grabbing her by the arms and forcing her back. She thrashed against them, sobbing wildly, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls as she screamed about the millions she had just lost. Court is adjourned, Judge Carter announced, slamming her gavel down one final time with absolute authority. She stood up and walked out of the courtroom, not looking back at the pathetic spectacle unfolding at the plaintiff table. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit. Diana Chen stood beside me, a quiet smile of professional satisfaction playing on her lips. "We did it," she whispered. "Yes, we did," I replied softly. I looked at Melanie one last time. She was slumped against the table, sobbing hysterically into her arms, completely abandoned by her husband, her lawyer, and her dignity. I felt absolutely nothing for her. The sister I once knew had died a long time ago, replaced by the greedy phantom currently weeping over a frozen bank account. I turned my back on her and walked down the center aisle. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom were pushed open by my security detail. I stepped out into the brightly lit hallway, taking a deep breath of the cool, conditioned air. The legal war was over. The children were safe. The trust was secure. But as I adjusted my briefcase to leave, two figures stepped out from the shadows near the waiting area, Richard and Patricia. My parents looked entirely different than they had just an hour ago. The arrogant swagger was completely gone. Richard's shoulders were slumped, his expensive suit looking suddenly too large for his frame. Patricia clutched her handbag nervously, her eyes darting between me and the closed courtroom doors. They had just watched their golden son-in-law get hauled away by federal agents, and they knew their favorite daughter had just been stripped of everything. More importantly, they knew exactly who was holding all the cards. I possessed the children. I controlled the $10 million trust, and I held the immediate foreclosure deed to their luxury mansion. They rushed forward, plastering painfully fake, desperate smiles onto their faces. "Allison, sweetheart," Patricia cried out, reaching her hands toward me as if we were the closest of friends. "Oh, thank goodness that is over. We were just so worried about you and the children." Richard stepped up beside her, attempting to puff out his chest and project the patriarchal authority he no longer possessed. "We are family, Allison," he said, his voice straining with forced warmth. "We knew you would do the right thing for the kids. Now why do we not all go back to the house, sit down and figure out how we are going to handle this mortgage situation together? You know, we love those grandbabies and they need their loving grandparents right now." I stared at the man who had spent 30 years making me feel like a second-class citizen in my own family. Richard stood there with a sickening, hopeful smile plastered across his aging face. Beside him, Patricia was nodding vigorously, her hands clasped tightly together against her designer blouse, as if she were in prayer. The sheer audacity of his request, the immediate shameless pivot from completely ignoring my existence to demanding a seat at my table, was breathtaking. I did not laugh. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the silence stretch between us in the cold hallway until Richard's fake patriarchal smile began to tremble at the edges. "You want to go back to the house and figure this out together?" I repeated, my voice devoid of any warmth or familial affection. "You think you can invoke the word family now that you are cornered?" Patricia took a tentative step forward, her expensive perfume preceding her. "Allison, please. We have all made mistakes in the past, but we are blood. The children need us during this transition. I held up a single steady hand, stopping her dead in her tracks. Do not ever speak to me about what Leo and Mia need. Where were their loving grandparents when they were standing on my freezing porch at 6 in the morning, clutching plastic garbage bags? You were sitting comfortably in your mansion, fully aware that your daughter and your prized son-in-law were fleeing federal indictments. You did not call the police. You did not call me to ensure they were safe. You protected the criminals and left 5-year-old and 3-year-old toddlers to entirely fend for themselves. Richard's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of crimson. That is not fair. We did not know the extent of Terrence's legal issues. We were trying to protect our daughter from a misunderstanding. You were trying to protect your social standing, I shot back, stepping directly into his personal space. The patriarch of the family flinched, instinctively backing away from my cold fury. Do not insult my intelligence, Richard. You protected Melanie because she was your golden investment. You spent my entire life making the hierarchy of this family crystal clear. When it was time for college, you told me I went to a cheap public school, while you funded Melanie's luxury private university and her lavish semester in Paris. When I started my business, you laughed and told me not to quit my day job. But when Terrence needed capital to cover his fraudulent tracks and the walls were closing in, you demanded I use my meager savings to bail out a criminal. Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her throat as she looked around the hallway to see if anyone was listening. We were only doing what we thought was best for the family portfolio. The family portfolio is exactly why you are standing here begging me right now. I said, my tone absolute ice. You do not care about Leo. You do not care about Mia. You care that the $10 million trust is legally locked away from you forever. You care that the golden son-in-law you paraded around the country club is currently being fingerprinted and processed at a federal holding facility. And most importantly, you care that I am the one holding the promissory note on your foreclosed mansion. Richard's facade completely crumbled. The false warmth vanished, replaced by desperate, naked panic. His hands actually began to shake. Allison, you cannot do this. We will be absolutely ruined. The bank is threatening to lock the doors by the end of the month. You have the trust now. You have the money. You can clear the debt. You owe us that much for raising you. I owe you absolutely nothing, I stated, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. I bought that debt legally. It is an asset managed by my firm. And I am not running a charity for enablers. You tied your financial wagon to Terrence, ignoring every single red flag because he bought you expensive dinners and secured your elite country club status. You made your choice years ago when you decided Melanie and Terrence were the future, and I was just the disappointment. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a crisp white manila envelope. I had kept it ready for exactly this moment, waiting for the verdict to be finalized. I handed it directly to Richard. He stared at it as if I were handing him a live explosive. "What is this?" Patricia whispered, her voice trembling with absolute terror. "That is your formal eviction notice," I replied. My eyes locked onto Richard's defeated face. I expedited the foreclosure proceedings the moment the ink dried on the transfer. You do not have until the end of the month to figure out a backup plan. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the property. If you are still inside that house by 8 o'clock on Saturday morning, I will have the county sheriff physically remove you, and your belongings will be placed on the curb for the entire neighborhood to see. Patricia let out a strangled, breathless cry, her knees buckling beneath her. Richard caught her by the arm, but his own legs looked ready to give out entirely. "You are a monster," Richard hissed, his face twisted in hateful disbelief. "You are throwing your own parents out onto the street without a second thought." "I am enforcing a strict legal contract on a defaulted loan," I corrected him calmly. "I am doing exactly what you taught me to do all my life. I am being a ruthless businesswoman." Before Richard could hurl another desperate insult, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom slowly creaked open. Melanie stumbled out into the hallway. She looked like a ghost. Her expensive designer dress was wrinkled, her perfect blowout was a tangled mess, and her mascara was smeared in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. She was entirely alone. Arthur Pendleton had vanished out a side exit, abandoning her the second the gavel fell, and Terrence was already on his way to a federal prison cell. Melanie looked up, her bloodshot eyes darting frantically around the hallway until they landed on our parents. The sight of them seemed to spark a tiny, pathetic ember of hope in her chest. She dragged herself toward them, her hands reaching out just as Patricia had done moments ago. "Mom! Dad!" Melanie sobbed, her voice a ragged, broken rasp. "They took him. They took everything. The judge locked the money away. I have nothing left. My credit cards are frozen. I cannot even get a hotel room for the night. Please, I need to come home with you. Let me stay at the house. We can call your lawyers and figure this out." The ultimate irony hung in the air, heavy and perfectly poetic. Melanie, the undisputed favorite, the golden child who could do no wrong, was expecting the unconditional safety net she had enjoyed for her entire life. She was expecting her parents to wrap their arms around her, shield her from the consequences of her actions, and fix the mess. Instead, Richard looked at the eviction notice trembling in his hand. He looked at the 48-hour deadline that was currently destroying his entire reality and obliterating his social standing. Then slowly, the patriarch of the family lifted his head and looked at his golden child. His eyes, usually filled with overwhelming pride and adoration for Melanie, were now completely devoid of anything but raw, unadulterated resentment. He did not open his arms. He did not offer a comforting word or a promise of salvation. Richard took a deliberate physical step backward, pulling Patricia with him. "Do not call me Richard," spat his voice laced with pure venom. "You brought this federal investigation to my doorstep. You let that criminal ruin my finances and drag our name through the mud. I am losing my home in 2 days because of you." Melanie froze, her hands still suspended in the air. "Dad?" She whimpered, genuine shock breaking through her hysteria. Her mind simply could not process the rejection. "I have no home to give you," Richard snarled, turning his back on his favorite daughter without a single ounce of hesitation. "You are completely on your own." The reverberation of Richard's final venomous rejection hung in the sterile courthouse hallway. Melanie stood paralyzed, her mouth agape, watching the two people who had shielded her from every consequence of her entire life walk out the glass double doors without a single backward glance. The golden safety net had been completely shredded. For the first time in 30 years, Melanie Vance was entirely untethered from wealth, status, and protection. The subsequent 30 days delivered a masterclass in absolute, irreversible destruction. The federal judge presiding over Terrence's arraignment did not share Arthur Pendleton's previous courtroom optimism. Due to the meticulously documented offshore accounts and the explicit audio evidence of his flight risk, bail was unequivocally denied. Terrence traded his bespoke Italian wool suits for a scratchy neon orange jumpsuit. His days of dictating corporate mergers in glass boardrooms were instantly replaced by the harsh, echoing reality of a federal detention center. The golden boy of Chicago finance was now just another inmate, waiting for a transfer to a medium-security penitentiary. His offshore accounts were frozen by the SEC, his physical assets seized, his professional reputation completely radioactive. He sat on a thin cot, staring at a cinder-block wall, entirely stripped of the arrogant smirk that had fueled his entire existence, facing decades behind bars. 48 hours. That was the precise deadline I had given Richard and Patricia, and I did not grant them a single second of grace. On Saturday morning, the county sheriff arrived at the gated driveway of the Beacon Hill estate with a formal eviction order. Richard and Patricia had spent 2 frantic, sleepless days calling every contact in their elite social register, begging for emergency loans or a temporary place to stay. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The wealthy are exceptionally skilled at smelling blood in the water, and my parents were hemorrhaging social capital. They were forced to stand on the sidewalk, humiliated under the watchful eyes of their wealthy neighbors, as deputies supervised the removal of their remaining personal items. They relocated to a cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment in a decaying building on the outskirts of the city. The contrast was physically jarring. There were no vaulted ceilings, no crystal chandeliers, and no mahogany dining tables. Instead, There was peeling linoleum, water-stained walls, and the constant vibrating hum of a failing refrigerator. Patricia, a woman who had never cooked a meal in her life, now spent her evenings reading the instructions on frozen microwave dinners under a flickering fluorescent light. The country club formally revoked their membership, citing a failure to pay the annual dues. Their former friends crossed the street to avoid them at the grocery store. The suffocating silence of their new reality was punctuated only by their bitter, endless arguments. Standing in their tiny kitchen, bumping elbows as they navigated the confined space, Richard viciously blamed Patricia for raising a greedy, entitled daughter. Patricia screamed back, blaming Richard for trusting a corporate fraud and losing their fortune. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, poisoned by the very narcissism that had destroyed their family. But the most profound poetic justice belonged entirely to Melanie. When she walked out of that courthouse, she quickly discovered that every credit card bearing her name was instantly declined. Her accounts were flagged and frozen by the federal investigation into Terrence. She managed to secure a room in a seedy neon-lit motel off the interstate only by pawning her diamond tennis bracelet for a pathetic fraction of its actual value. The woman who had happily packed her bags for a luxury resort in Bora Bora was now staring at cracked ceiling tiles and listening to the roar of heavy highway traffic through a paper-thin window. Survival required an immediate income, and Melanie possessed exactly zero marketable skills. She had never worked a day in her adult life. After a week of desperate, humiliating rejections from high-end retail boutiques that recognized her ruined name, she was forced to accept a minimum wage position at a local fast food franchise. The uniform was made of cheap, unbreathable polyester. It smelled permanently of old cooking grease and industrial sanitizer. On a rainy Tuesday evening, Melanie found herself on her hands and knees, holding a bristled brush, aggressively scrubbing a sticky soda spill off the tiled floor of the restaurant lobby. Her expensive manicured nails were chipped and ruined. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead. She looked up just as a customer walked through the double doors. It was a woman from her former country club tennis league. Melanie froze, the scrub brush slipping from her trembling fingers. The woman looked down, recognized the disgraced socialite scrubbing the floor, and simply looked right through her, stepping carefully around the puddle to order a diet soda. The absolute humiliation of the moment settled deep into Melanie's bones, a crushing, suffocating weight. She had thrown away her beautiful children and a life of immense privilege for a financial payout that never materialized. She was nobody. While Melanie wiped grease from her polyester uniform and my parents ate their frozen dinners in bitter, resentful silence, my world was bathed in a completely different light. The heavy, dark clouds that had hung over my life for the past year had entirely dissipated. I stood in the expansive kitchen of my home, the late afternoon sun streaming through the large bay windows, casting a warm, golden glow across the polished hardwood floors. The smell of baking chocolate chip cookies filled the air, replacing the sterile scent of courtrooms and lawyer offices. I took a deep, grounding breath, listening to the sweetest sound I had ever heard echoing from the living room. The sound echoing from the living room was a symphony of uninhibited giggles. I set down the spoon and wiped my hands. Stepping out of the kitchen, I moved through the sunlit corridor toward the back of the house. The tall glass doors opened onto a massive manicured backyard bordered by towering oak trees. For a long moment, I simply stood at the threshold, allowing the warm June breeze to wash over my face. 6 months had passed since Judge Carter struck her gavel, severing the rotting branch of my biological family tree. 6 months since I traded the relentless, cutthroat adrenaline of the boardroom for a profoundly different kind of daily stakes. I was no longer merely a corporate strategist dissecting market vulnerabilities. I was a mother. Out on the green lawn, Leo and Mia were engaged in a fierce, joyful battle involving a garden hose and a pair of bright plastic buckets. The transformation in these two children over the past half-year was miraculous. The hollow, haunted look that had shadowed Leo's young face when he first stood freezing on my porch was completely gone. The crippling night terrors that caused him to wake up screaming convinced he was being thrown away with the garbage, had entirely subsided. He had filled out his cheeks flushed with healthy color, his movements bursting with the chaotic, confident energy of a little boy who finally knew he was safe. Mia, who had spent her first week in my home completely mute, clutching a torn teddy bear in absolute catatonia, was currently shrieking with delight. She sprinted across the grass, her small feet kicking up droplets of water as she evaded her brother's ambush. She was talking in full, bright sentences, singing wildly out of tune and demanding bedtime stories with the delightful entitlement of a cherished child. They were no longer liabilities. They were not strategic chess pieces in a federal evasion plot. They were just children. They were my children. I stepped onto the patio, leaning against the wooden railing to watch the spectacle. I had spent my entire adult life building impenetrable armor. I had weaponized my intellect to survive the toxic, narcissistic battleground of Richard and Patricia's household. I had accumulated wealth to ensure I would never have to depend on people who viewed me as a disappointment. But standing here watching the water catch the sunlight as it sprayed across the lawn, I realized that all that armor, all that accumulated power, was simply preparation for this exact reality. I had built a fortress so that Leo and Mia could have a sanctuary. Leo suddenly dropped his bucket, his eyes catching sight of me on the patio. His face lit up with a grin that could rival the sun. He abandoned his water war, his small legs pumping as he sprinted across the grass toward the wooden steps. Mia noticed his sudden departure and immediately followed suit, dropping her own bucket and racing behind him. They scrambled up the steps, their clothes thoroughly soaked, leaving tiny wet footprints on the polished deck. "Look what we made," Leo shouted, pointing proudly back toward a muddy puddle forming near the rose bushes. "It is a castle moat." I laughed, reaching out to ruffle his damp hair. "It is a very impressive moat," I agreed, handing him a plush towel. Mia pushed her way forward, wrapping her small, wet arms tightly around my legs. She looked up at me, her bright eyes shining with absolute, unfiltered trust. "We are hungry, Mom," she declared with absolute certainty. The word hit my chest with the force of a physical impact. Mom. They had been calling me Aunt Allison for the first few months, gradually shifting to temporary nicknames as they tested the waters of our new dynamic. But this was the first time the word had been spoken aloud, so casually, so naturally, as if it were an undeniable fact of the universe. Leo nodded in furious agreement, oblivious to the profound weight of what his sister had just said. "Can we have the cookies now, Mom?" he asked, grabbing a corner of the towel to dry his face. My throat tightened, a sudden rush of fierce, overwhelming emotion threatening to spill over. I knelt down on the damp wood, ignoring the water soaking into my clothes, and pulled them both into a tight, fierce embrace. "Yes," I whispered, my voice thick. "You can have as many cookies as you want." After I ushered them inside to change into dry clothes, I walked into my home office. The room was quiet, lined with dark bookshelves and a large stone fireplace. I walked over to my desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside rested a single crumpled piece of paper. It was the frantic, cowardly note Melanie had scribbled and shoved into one of the black trash bags on the morning she abandoned them. I had kept it for 6 months, a tangible reminder of the cruelty I was fighting against. I walked over to the fireplace, striking a long wooden match against the brick. I touched the flame to the edge of the paper, watching the fire catch, and quickly spread across Melanie's frantic handwriting. I dropped the burning note into the grate. The flames consumed the lies, the greed, and the toxic legacy of the family that had raised me. I watched the paper curl and blacken, turning into fragile gray ash before crumbling into nothingness. The past was permanently incinerated. I had shielded the innocent and constructed an entirely new empire from the ashes of their destruction. I turned away from the hearth, walking back out into the sunlit corridor, where the joyful, chaotic sounds of my children debating cookie flavors echoed from the kitchen. My heart, once guarded and cold, felt incredibly full. Family is not an obligation forced upon you by genetics. Family is not blood that bleeds you dry. Family is who you choose to protect.